Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for the year-end list. Well, 2021 sure was a year. And definitely a weird year to be a fan of electronic music. On one hand, it'd be easy to just say this year was flat garbage, as we got to see seemingly every single one of our favorite popular electronic artists jump on a certain bandwagon fad of useless, energy-sucking cash grabs, and on that front alone, I might have been able to call it the worst year for the genre in recent memory. Even just music-wise, if I had only been paying attention to just the biggest mainstream projects in this genre, this probably would feel like the driest and most disappointing year for electronic music in a long time. I would have gotten Porter Robinson's comeback, maybe Floating Points or Arca if you count them, and that'd be about it. Not even to get into all the big disappointments from artists I typically love, hi BT. But that's why this year became so important to put forth the effort to dig deeper, because even if you look just a little beyond the surface level, you would start to find a lot more quality. And the further you dug, the more gems you would find. And I found so many that I didn't even have room to include Porter Robinson at all, even if I do really like that album and I know it's showing up on everyone else's year-end list. Just never really felt compelled to come back to that one after reviewing it. I don't know what to tell you. Still good. But yeah, pretty much all my favorite stuff from 2021 came from the underground. And while my list this year obviously won't be completely bereft of all the usual suspects, the majority of my picks came from artists I wasn't even listening to before this year, or maybe weren't even a thing at all before this year. There were quite a few debut projects that made big splashes in my mind. I bought 56 albums on Bandcamp this year, 57 if you include my pre-order of the Vale Smith album coming out next week, which is way more than any previous year. Felt good to just get in the habit of supporting artists directly. We may not have seen the same ridiculous quantity of great electronic releases from all camps that we saw in 2020, but that also meant my biggest favorites got more replay value out of me, and I got more mileage out of them compared to last year. And may as well get into the usual disclaimers. Obviously, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it. It just ranks on my own personal enjoyment at the time of recording the video. Replay value will definitely come into play, though. There are also a few projects that I didn't get into until fairly late in the year, so there's that too. May not reflect how I feel later down the line. Obviously, it's impossible for me to have heard every project that's come out this year, so if you want to share some that I might have missed in the comments, make sure to let me know about that. But this is the list of the albums that meant the most to me personally over the course of these past 12 months and made my otherwise kinda crap 2021 all the better. And I hope you can find some new stuff you might have not discovered before. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. The top 10 best albums of 2021. So before we get into the list itself, let's go through a bunch of honorable mentions. Honorable mention number 1, Igloo Ghost, Leyline Eon.
Slipping through the dust like a mite.
Gotta give a shout out to Igloo Ghost, who I guess isn't the most underground. He does get covered by plenty of other reviewers who aren't me. But whatever, this was the first project of 2021 that really started to stick with me longer term. I've seen people mark this as a bit of a letdown, or at least a step down from his debut thanks to its more low-key and stripped-back focus. Granted, more low-key than his debut is not saying much. Most things that exist are more low-key than his debut. But it is worth noting that he didn't actually make my year-end list in 2017, which was a markedly worse year for the genre than 2021. And he did make the cut this year. Neo X Bloom was mind-blowing in the short term, and I never felt the urge to listen to it again once I was done. But this one proved there's more to him than just pure flash and density for its own sake, and he was capable of making stuff that still had a strong emotional core, while keeping the crazy sound design that he's known for fully intact. I'd get the people who thought this was just fine or forgot about it a month after it came out, but this was the first time his stuff felt like it was clicking with me beyond the surface level, and created something I actually did want to come back to occasionally throughout the year. I like this a lot. Honorable mention number 2, Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders and the London Symphony Orchestra, Promises. This is probably the most obvious choice to make my list, and the one that I believe technically least qualifies as underground, given how over 11,000 people have bought it on Bandcamp alone. I rated this one really highly when I covered it in a Some Stuff I Missed roundup, so I suppose the surprise might be more that it's not even significantly higher on the list. I guess this one did shrink on me a bit since I covered it. I found it's not really the kind of project I can just put on any time and expect it to always hit the same way. Didn't get as much replay value as some of these other cuts as a result. But that doesn't really change the fact that it's a pretty great album. It's still an absolutely stunning blend of electronic, jazz, and orchestral music. It's a lovely and super low-key, near ambient composition that can ease anxiety. Those repeating 7-note phrases never get old. And while not every section is as riveting as the next, Movement 6 and 7 are such gigantic home runs for this project and are likely to shut up most naysayers. I may not have come back to it as much as I expected to after my first listen, but I still absolutely agree with the hype this one's amassed. Honorable mention number 3, 10 City, Judgment. Alright, here's the other not really underground pick. It's the only pick on my list here that I had to buy on iTunes instead of Bandcamp, and the one I discovered thanks to seeing it nominated for a Grammy right at the end of this year. But let's be real, these guys haven't been mainstream since the late 80s. Their nomination is just consolation for having been the first Chicago house artists to score a big charting Billboard hit, and they've got pretty much zero chance of winning that Grammy since A, I can't imagine enough of the voters actually know who they are, and B, the Grammys tend to lean away from black artists on average anyway. Shame, because it was the only electronic album nomination this year that I found genuinely exciting, let alone not mediocre to outright terrible. And I absolutely had to mention it because this has just been such an addicting listen over the past month. The first 3 tracks of this thing are unbelievably great. Classic Chicago house formulas with incredible vocal performances from Byron Stingley, who doesn't sound like he's aged a day since the 80s, and fantastic production from the legend Marshall Jefferson, who seemed fit to fill up all these mixes with so much detail and texture from horns and strings and that kind of extra cowbell over the typical banging house beats, which are more satisfying and well-balanced than even most of their older albums were. And of course some of the most ridiculously catchy hooks which have stuck with me for weeks and kept my spirits up. The rest of the album beyond those first 3 tracks are only good and not great. There's 3 remixes of their most recognizable hits from the 80s, and it ends with a track that shouts out Oakenfold and throws me off every single time. But I still liked all of this stuff enough that even when I only put on the album on for the first track, I just let it play out in its entirety and come out satisfied. I doubt it's going to have much long-term staying power into 2022, and it's definitely not a smart or deep listen in any capacity, but discovering it has legit made this year that little bit better for me, and I had to give it a shout. But speaking of addicting and mood-brightening turn-your-brain-off releases, perhaps even better ones, honorable mention number 4, Mossy Projects Volume 1, Side A and B. Oh, there's one of the usual suspects. This double EP for Michael Menard's side project with James 2, aka Trophy Beats, was just a really nice summery listen that put me in a great mood. It's obviously nowhere near as, dense as the likes of From the Sea, or Even If It Isn't Right. Not really a project designed for in-depth listening that has a lot of deep, thought-provoking material or big emotionally intense ideas. Really more of a turn-your-brain-off and vibe kind of listen. But it knows exactly what it is, thoroughly unpretentious, it does what it's trying to do extremely well, and it's kind of impossible to dislike. The vibes are absolutely immaculate, the atmosphere and production is fantastic, there's tons of catchy hooks and excellent standout moments. Dopester, Citroen, Stone Glance, 10,000 Blunts, Last Summer, etc. Side A is better than Side B, but you do need both together for the full experience, and there's no misses throughout the entire thing. It's easily my favorite Michael Menard-related project since From the Sea topped my 2018 year-end list, and certainly the most easily replayable thing he's put out since then, and if you've missed it, absolutely make sure to pick it up. Summer may be over, but this can hit any time. Honorable mention number 5, Corliss, Agor. Okay, here we got a newcomer. This guy already got a cosign from Fortet and a decent amount of buzz, and I can in fact also cosign this as a very solid and promising debut, and one that nothing else this year really sounded like. I mean, texturally it does sort of remind me of artists like Oneohtrix Point Never, and especially Clark, but Corliss definitely carved out his own lane with an interesting approach to that kind of sound design. A lot of mostly percussionless compositions with intense stabbing synths and female vocal snippets that still feel pretty driving and foot-tapping, taking elements from EDM, classical, and ambient without ever feeling like it could actually qualify as any of those. Lots of good melodies, neat textures, flows pretty well, and it's just a lot of fun to listen to. But while I'm on the topic of promising debut projects, honorable mention number 6, Kelvin, EFYL. Another one that managed to sneak on my radar right at the very end of the year and really deserves to have a lot more buzz than it's actually getting. This one's out there for those looking into upscale type material with big ambitious compositions and awesome super detailed sound design. It's not nearly as glitchy or dense as your Koan sounds and culprates, but the way it combines that kind of style with like peak period Ultimate Records, artists like Solar Fields and Carbon-Based Lifeforms, takes a lot of elements from their organic and immersive and often pretty epic approach to ambient music as well. It's just really fantastic sounding stuff. Just from a stylistic standpoint, this was pretty much guaranteed a spot here. It didn't quite make the list proper, as I'd have a hard time telling individual tracks apart from each other, can run together a bit, aside from maybe the 2 tracks with guest features from Roby and Dearest Alex, which were probably the 2 biggest standouts, especially the latter one. Also, my actual number 10 pick on this list fell under a very similar sonic umbrella and connected with me a little more. But even so, for an artist with this little of a backing or following, this is ridiculously impressive. As far as I can tell, Kelvin only has an audience slightly bigger than that of my own music, despite sounding like the kind of thing I would have guessed had a much bigger following. So, absolutely make sure to pick this up at your earliest convenience. This is something special, and I bet you they've got the potential to put out something that could be even more impressive further down the line. Honorable mention number 7, Hannah Peel for Wave. Alright, if Oliver from Deep Cuts hasn't already put you onto this one, allow me to co-sign it quite heavily as well. When I first heard about this album from him, he described it as an artist taking the synth work from pioneers such as Delia Derbyshire and building those sounds into a new concept album about the ecological cycles of the earth. And I was like, yes please, I need to hear this immediately. This is definitely one that speaks to the 70s synth pioneer lover in me. Tinges from all sorts of artists from that era like Tangerine Dream and Jean-Michel Jarre, or even a few moments that pulls from the styles of more modern artists like John Hopkins, putting together 7 tracks that all feel very distinct and create really striking compositions ranging from more ambient leaning to a bit more energetic and beat driven, and all of it is really good and never feels like a novelty. The short length does absolutely leave me hungering for more, but makes it pretty easily replayable as well. A really cool fusion of both the new and the old styles of electronic music. It's just as cool as it sounded on paper and has really stuck around with me throughout the back half of this year, so if you missed it, check it out! Honorable mention number 8, Amon Tobin, How Do You Live? Amon Tobin is one of those artists who feels like he should be one of the usual suspects, but he really isn't. Maybe if I'd been a reviewer in the 2000s he would have been, given how many old classics he's dropped. But the last time he put out a project that made one of my year-end lists was ISAM for my retrospective 2011 list. Granted, most of the 2010s he kept pretty quiet, and his recent explosion of output since going independent in 2019 has been a bit of a mixed blessing, with mostly projects that I at best have only really liked and not quite loved. But How Do You Live feels like it combined everything that worked about all his no-mark releases, side aliases included, and put all he learned together in one strange and experimental but still excitingly odd mix of influences from the likes of 60s psych rock and ancient synth pioneer material. Now, this album has absolutely not been for everyone. I've seen a lot of people mark it as a mediocre letdown, and I will admit that it suffers from both needing the support of all his no-mark cinematic universe's context to get the best possible experience, not standing on its own as well as it could, as well as occasionally being a bit on the intentionally unpleasant side. I definitely understand if this didn't click for you, but I have found myself coming back to this one a decent bit even after my video went up, and just like Fear and a Handful of Dust, it just kept growing on me. It might even just beat that one out as my favorite thing he's put out in this whole no-mark era so far. It's still not on the level of Foley Room or his other Ninja Tune stuff. I do pine for the days when his work was more self-contained, but for what it is, I've had a lot of fun with it. And while we're on the topic of artists who haven't made my year-end list since 2011, honorable mention number 9, Ace Dana, A. Period. It has been 7 years since any project released on Ultimate Records would have made my year-end lists, and it has been a full decade since the last album from Ace Dana that would have made my year-end list. His Parameters album made my retrospective list for 2011. And honestly, if not for another project that I found right near the end of the year that really started to click with me last minute, this would have made the list proper. Call this my honorary number 11 pick. This album meant a lot to me this year for so many reasons, not just because its moody blend of subtle ambience carried such a strong emotional resonance that I haven't felt out of an Ultimate album in so long, but the way it texturally sat in line with all this other bleaker and moodier material the label's put out in the past several years made me realize maybe this label's shift in sound and ethos hasn't actually translated into a drop in quality as I may have thought, and I've just been looking at this stuff wrong. I still have to properly sit with most of the newer Ultimate projects, but I have skimmed through a bunch of them and started to feel that same sense of excitement I used to when I browsed through this label all the time back in their peak. Master Margarita's Border 50, Mictec's Hereafter, Martin Onsack's Treeline, these all sounded really good for what they were, and Cell's Live at Corfu just straight up sounds like the old peak period Ultimate too. But A period was the real eye-opener because it doesn't sound like the label's peak period stuff, it just demonstrated to me how the label's core appeal may lie in a different place now, and got me to reconsider my old negative feelings. A lot of this stuff could scratch an itch for material like what The Black Dog deliver. Those guys also released a really solid ambient album this year, by the way, that just missed the cut. You should check it out. But I digress. A period may have been overtaken by other albums this year and felt more like a way for me to get into other projects, but it is still a fantastic collection of bleak and sad ambient compositions with subtle techno leanings that kept me invested from start to finish, and is absolutely worth people's time. It's really stuck with me. And I think that'll be enough honorable mentions, but there were also a lot of projects this year that had like some great individual tracks that I loved that I maybe wouldn't have room to mention otherwise. So as a bonus, I'll go through a bunch of those tracks, all from releases worth checking out in their entirety if you feel so inclined, going alphabetically by artist.
The sky's still here. I'll be alive next year.
Right, I'm gonna cut it off there. Let's get into the list proper. Number 10. Aleph, Ego Death. Alright, out of all the upscale type artists to drop something this year, I think this was probably my favorite. I do still find the second half of the title track on this album to be a bit of an unnecessary momentum killer, and it samples from a woman doing drugs for the first time or something like that to be maybe a bit self-aggrandizing, hence how this only ended up at the number 10 spot. But the way this album combines all sorts of aspects of this glitchy and abstract scene and pulls it off in one really cohesive, seamlessly flowing and replayable experience, The ambient cuts like Breathe, Decomposition, and Recovery are beautiful, expansive, and immersive. The beat-focused cuts like Noise Floor, REM, and even that receding black bar interlude are a ton of glitchy, hard-hitting fun. And the way all these cuts link together and work off each other is really freaking cool across the board. Pretty much anyone who actually knew it existed was buzzing about it. And even if Alepht's already started to pick up a decent Hudson Lee-sized following off of it, I'm almost kind of surprised it didn't get even more buzz than it did. This guy and Kelvin were the two biggest gems on this scene this year, and even if Kelvin's a lot more overlooked than this guy, they're both absolutely worth your time. Good year for promising debuts, I'd say, and there's even more of those further up the list. Although not actually the next one, but yeah. Number 9. Hybrid, Black Halo. Alright, got the unusual suspects on the list proper, and you know I love a band when this is technically one of my least favorite albums of theirs and it still ended up here. Fun fact, shortly after I posted my review of this one, Charlotte Truman DM'd me on Twitter asking if I'd be interested in having a conversation via Zoom regarding the deeper meaning of the lyrics of this album, and when I got that notification, I think I had a stroke on the spot. The interview obviously ended up not happening, as A, our schedules didn't match up, and B, I low-key didn't really want to pursue it, as I had a strong feeling I was going to pull a Chris Farley in front of them and be left stuttering with no idea what to say. Even if it would have been pretty cool, and I'm honored that they actually offered that, purely for the sake of my own nerves, it's probably for the best that it didn't happen. But yeah, anyway, my thoughts on this album have in fact wavered all over the place since I first heard it, but it has steadily grown on me. I still think it gets a little spotty in its second half. Truth from the Lies still hits a weird note, not because I think their exploration of modern news cycles and online society feels unwarranted or shallow. I still quite enjoy it and find it to be pretty resonant in a vacuum. It just feels kind of weird being put in this supposed concept album about an angel falling to earth, and the switch from vague metaphor to a more literal reminder of the crappiness of our real-life society takes me out of the experience a little bit. I also kind of wish End of the World had a different title that didn't hype you up for something a lot more intense than what they actually delivered. But at the same time, I've grown to really love the entire first half up through the track Carry Me Home. That includes former possible least favorites like Nails, which I no longer take much issue with. The songcraft and hooks and production are too spot on for me to resist anymore. And the album's opening 3-track run and final track are so unbelievably great that it makes up for any possible issues I might have with the middle. No One Knows and Sky Full of Diamonds are, in particular, like 2 of my favorite songs of the entire year. At the end of the day, this has kind of had a similar effect on me as that last Chemical Brothers album, where I might have had a lot of issues initially, but as time went on, I gradually stopped caring about those issues and just enjoyed it for what it was. I may still find Disappear Here and Light of the Fearless to be even stronger albums, but I'm just always going to be glad to get more Hybrid. And I still easily came back to this enough over the course of the year where it had to nab a spot on this list. So long as they keep making music, so long as I keep using Finished Symphony as buffer music for my year-end lists, and so long as the word Angle is in my channel name thanks to their debut album, I have a feeling they're just going to keep showing up on these lists. Number 8. Fela, Soma. This is the most recent addition to the list proper. I didn't check out Fela until right near the end of the year, but I've ended up feeling the urge to come back to this one quite a bit, and it's only been growing on me more and more since the little Some Stuff I Miss segment I did on it. I'd honestly never even heard of Fela before this year, and having gone through his catalog, aside from his excellent 2010 album Fallen Light, which I still probably like a little more than this new one, I don't think he would have been one of the usual suspects if I'd known about him longer. I'm honestly kind of glad that this was my jumping on point because despite sticking to the same sounds he stuck to his whole career, Soma is probably his strongest and most replayable work in over a decade. Some of the most refreshing and uplifting blends of organic downtempo I've heard in quite some time. I even find it to be a more consistent listen than I initially gave it credit for. Previous low points like Dusk and Polar, which I used to think were kind of filler-ish, have ended up clicking with me just as much as my actual favorite moments. I think they're surprisingly catchy and hypnotic. Not even to get into the garage adjacent more up-tempo cuts like Introspection, Okab, and Elemental. Those are beautiful. The more ambient leaning cuts like Tantalus and Elysian Fields are really warm and immersive. And that includes all the interludes. I wouldn't want to skip any of those. And every track feels like it has its own recognizable identity. The production is obviously immaculate from start to finish. Feels like you're being lowered into a big comfy hot tub of dance and down-tempo or something like that. The melodies and sound design are consistently spot on. This is just an amazing body of work, and maybe if I'd have checked it out when it actually came out instead of getting into it so last minute, it might have even ended up higher on the list. But there have been other under-the-radar ambient projects that I've stuck with through a more substantial chunk of the year. For instance... Number 7. Katya Crow. I've called off the search. I know exactly where you are. Of all the straight ambient projects that came out this year, I think this would have to be the one that I've gotten the most replay value out of. Honestly, has a few similar notes to that Phala project. It's got an interesting mix of warm and immersive synth ambience combined with folk and dream pop elements. There's a number of cuts on this thing that are mostly made out of plucking guitar sounds. The whole thing has a particularly organic feel to everything. Though this album is far darker, bleaker, and lonelier than Soma. It starts out fairly warm and inviting and just gets progressively darker the further the album goes along, even incorporating light noise music elements that never get too abrasive, but consistently remaining emotionally involved, an ode to some kind of unimaginable loss. And in spite of how chilling the implications of the final track seeming to symbolize the listener's own death may be, and how literally chilling the penultimate cut is, seriously, that track's shifting pads could have been pulled out of Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 and how spooky but still alluring they sound, and how it feels like the temperature of the room physically lowers while they're playing. This entire album has ended up a surprisingly replayable experience as well that I just kept wanting to come back to and experience in its full entirety. Something about its isolated melancholy has felt oddly comforting, and it always seems to zip by so quickly in spite of how brooding and slow-paced it is. Add this to the list of stunning under-the-radar debut projects that not nearly enough people have been talking about or highlighting. It's really something special. But while we're on the topic of ambient-adjacent debut projects that haven't gotten enough attention... Number 6. Lear, Biome. Katya Crow may have had my favorite entirely ambient project, but this guy had my favorite half-ambient project of the year. The idea behind this one, just on paper, was really cool sounding. Artist Gareth Williams, who is based in Germany and not Wales, he went out to the tropical rainforests of Borneo to record loads of field recordings and created an environmental-themed concept album out of it. The first half of the album, containing all ambient compositions created purely out of manipulations of said field recordings, which you might not have been able to tell by how musical they ended up being, and the second half goes for a more straightforward techno approach with much darker sounding titles like Intrusion Number 509 and Encroachment, as symbolism for humanity having ruined such environments with their industrial complexes. And both halves are great. The ambient stuff is very subtle but still very dramatic and lush, and the techno stuff is even better and can get pretty damn epic with its sleek and mechanical percussion patterns and cold and icy melodies. Even though it only stretches on for an all too brief 45 minutes, there's so much variety and texture and intriguing ideas that all work into his overarching concept. And again, this is his debut effort. As far as I can tell, he hasn't released anything at all prior to 2021, at least under this name, if not just in general. And if this is just how he's starting out, I can't wait to hear what he'll have in store later down the line. Absolutely check it out if you've missed it. Number 5. Basic Rhythm, Electronic Labyrinth. A running theme of the projects in my top 5 this year was people taking traditionalist formulas from genres like techno and breakbeat and whatnot and either knocking them out of the park while playing them completely straight, or doing cool new stuff with those core formulas. Maybe a bit of both. And I think a good place to start with that kind of stuff would be this project from Basic Rhythm over here. Yet again, an artist I had never heard of before this year, although I think this is his 3rd album to date. Have yet to hear his other stuff. But this was such a cool and creative project, right from the very first cut, which completely deconstructs Kraftwerk's techno-pop and Electric Cafe. Literally an original song made out of samples from those two tracks. I was totally pulled in immediately. And then he just kept delivering cool ideas and twists on tried and true techno formulas, from the woodwind sampling Hayward Road, the hip-hop tinged Larkin' Around, the non-linear bangers of the title track and techno, to cuts with more delicate melodic textures like Palace of the Peacock and The Secret Ladder, or the old school Mr. Fingers era Acid House throwback fittingly titled Acid Track. Just 8 tracks once again, and even shorter than the Lear album, only 39 minutes total. But there was just so much cool stuff and really intriguing ideas packed within that short length that I just kept wanting to come back to it over the course of this year. And to think I had just thrown it into an album roundup as a filler pick on the promise of its cool looking album cover and not much else. I've seen practically no buzz for this one at all, or even anyone besides me talking about it. But this really was such a cool, undiscovered gem that I think deserved to get a lot more traction than it actually did. Check it out! But while I'm on the topic of creative techno artists who I've seen no one else besides me talking about, and way more of a surprise than that guy. Number 4. Dakuan, Memphis Innovation. This artist not getting any traction at least makes more sense to me because, unlike Basic Rhythm, who at least had backing and promotion from Planet Mew, this guy's got no label backing at all. He's just part of the infinite sea of self-released artists on Bandcamp. Hadn't released anything under this particular alias before 2021. Though he does have another album released a few months before this that I completely forgot about. And was primarily working under the name DJ Dance Alone, doing like vaporwave adjacent stuff before that. But I only found out about him because he came to me directly. He sent this album in to me for a $10 Patreon request on that tier where I usually just write up a public text post giving feedback to whatever small-time artists pay for it. I don't tend to have high expectations of quality out of artists sending their own albums to me. Most are just okay at best, or sound like worse versions of their favorite artists. And I absolutely wouldn't have looked into this guy if he hadn't paid me to. But he completely threw me for a loop with this album, as it is by far the best album I've heard from that Patreon tier. 12 tracks of non-stop techno bangers with lots of variety and texture, occasionally influenced by the likes of artists like A Guy Called Gerald or Burial, but consistently fantastic grooves that always hit really hard and remain danceable and attention-grabbing even through 72 minutes. That length could have felt really long and drawn out, but it never did for me. All of it felt justified. The mastering may not be very well polished, but it has its own underground charm to it, I guess. This stuff never got old or ran together even through those extended lengths, and just kept delivering banger after banger that all sounded different, from more intense industrial-leaning cuts like Black Forest, to acid house influenced stuff like Sloth Lodge, to brighter, poppier, melodic stuff like Chapters, to more subtle and soulful Burial-influenced material like Loves and Dreams or Downstairs, to stuff that sounded like old-school Detroit techno like Fuck Clint Eastwood. There's a song title for you. All of it is really freaking good. I could not freaking believe how credible it sounded when I first put it on, and I just kept coming back to it even well after I put up my video on it. It's just such a wall-to-wall, really fun listen. I don't think this guy's gonna be seeing much promotion outside of this video, but he is absolutely deserving of your attention if you've got any passing interest in underground techno. Do not let this guy go overlooked. Number 3. CFAX Acid Crew, Box Steady. I'd known about Andy Jenkinson for years, but 2021 was the year I finally sat down to listen to his stuff and discover what a great acid techno artist he can be, with a great, goofy, shitposty sense of humor. And it turns out this may have been a great year in particular to finally jump into his stuff, as his latest effort here, Box Steady, may very well be his best work to date. CFAX has explored excellent mixes of retro acid grooves for over 20 years, but as the years have gone by, he's only further and further honed his craft, and with this project, he just keeps delivering all his catchiest and most playful synth bangers, totally immersing itself in that retro aesthetic, but never sounding cheap, and especially showing off his talent for coming up with addicting melodies. All 12 tracks on this thing sound great and distinct in their own right, from bright and poppy melodic cuts like Amigo and Fossil Funk, More chill, deep house-leaning cuts like House Dream and News Round. Percussive bangers with breakbeat tinges like Dark Side, Flange Slap, and Bureau de Rave. Not a single miss in the bunch. But the two biggest highlights for me were easily Eurozone and his cover of John Barry's Capsule in Space. The former of those is such tasty 90s deep house with all those retro MIDI pianos I love and amazing melodies. Fantastic album closer. And the latter of those two is probably just straight up my most listened to track of the whole year. I absolutely love the way those James Bond soundtrack melodies get worked into these video game synths, and that one little moment where the song just like momentarily stops and those bass lines just go do 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 do, and then the song just picks up right back from there. That was like the best 2 seconds of music I've heard in 2021. I dare you to listen to this whole album without cracking a smile. I don't think it's possible. I've come back to this thing so much over the course of the year. I've already thought it was great on first listen, and it's only gotten better and better the more time I've spent with it. Anyone who likes themselves some retro synth grooves, or even those who don't, should absolutely be picking this one up as well. Avoid only if you dislike fun. Number 2. Wayward, Waiting for the World. Well, you knew this was coming. If this were ranked purely on how many times I've listened to a given album in full, I think Wayward probably took the top spot this year. It may be true that these guys aren't delivering any super creative twists on their atmospheric breakbeat formulas. They're mostly sticking to well-trodden, tried-and-true territory. Wow, I wrote a tongue twister there. And the influence of Burial's Untrue is obvious enough where they wouldn't have needed to say it at all, and I think most people could figure it out. But this really did hit such a visceral, personal note for me that I was not prepared for, having just found it thanks to a single tweet from the official Bandcamp Twitter, and hoping to round out a Some Stuff I Missed volume without having seen any kind of buzz for it elsewhere. But I connected with it on first listen, and by third listen, I was so enamored with it that I knew I had to give it its own proper video. What Wayward lacked in originality, they made up for in craftsmanship. Every breakbeat and every melody felt so perfectly placed and composed to hit the most effective note they could. Pitched up vocal samples rarely sound as pleasant or even anxiety-easing as they were here. Everything added up to this perfect melancholy mood that was so well enveloping and swept me away every time I put it on. I didn't have many opportunities to go into downtown Chicago this year, but this experience just threw me back to when I was in college and just got to walk through the city at night all the time. It was so well balanced too, both in terms of production and pacing. Tracks that could bang like All a Bit Mad or feel chill like 33 or Bright, or more often both at once. See the title track, Canvey Island, Ridge Road, Casper Part 2. The whole thing is super tight as well with just 10 tracks at 45 minutes, no filler. Even the one interlude, Jill, feels like one of the deepest emotional moments here. And it felt really great when I put out my video and it didn't tank like most videos I do on comparatively smaller artists like this. I got a number of people who told me my recommendation was the final push they needed to check Wayward out, and they turned out to love it just as much as I did. Which is one of the best feelings you can have as a reviewer. Oh yeah, and this is only their debut album as well. They have put out EPs for years before this, which seems to range from equally great to just decent. And there is a part of me who wants to refrain from overhyping them as a result. But if it turns out they can pull off even more albums that reach this standard of quality, I obviously won't be hesitating anymore. And even if this is all they got in them, you know what? This album just felt so tailor-made for my tastes and hit such a personal note for me that I'll take it anyway. These guys really made my 2021, and even if it doesn't last, they can get all the accolades for how much they resonated with me this year. Well, them and my actual number 1 pick, which may not nearly be as much of an undiscovered gem as these guys, or even the majority of my other picks for this list, but hit a lot of similar notes and happened to pull them off maybe even better and more impressively, and came from somebody who lived up to the hype he set for me before. Number 1. Ski Mask. Pool. You know, it's kind of weird. It's entirely possible I get some blowback for this topic, as I've seen quite a few people mark this album as a big letdown after all the promise this guy showed on Compro in 2018. If that is your perspective, that's fine. Your loss. But this is still my list, and this was the single project this year that I felt landed in the 9 out of 10 range, personal enjoyment-wise, when I reviewed it. And of course I stand by that. I had already known my top 3 was going to be exactly what it was since, like, July. Now, I mentioned that as much as I loved Wayward's album, I wanted to see where they'll head next with a follow-up a few years from now, and don't know yet if my loving their one album is a fluke. But that's exactly the point at where I was with Ski Mask 3 years ago. I loved Compro as much as everyone else, even to the point of highlighting that album in a Best of the Decade list. But it was still just one album, and I didn't really care for the Shred album he'd put out a few years before that. There was absolutely a chance his success could be a fluke. But I think you can tell how that turned out. I stand by my previous statement that I believe this album to be even better than Compro, delivering all the exact same moody vibes as before but expanded even further. And after hearing this, I realized Ski Mask could now just become one of the usual suspects for these lists. He could just do the same kinds of formulas he did here over and over for the rest of his career, and I'd likely just keep eating it up. There's so much versatility on display here. He can nail breakbeat, IDM, techno, dub, ambient, drum and bass, hip-hop, electro, and seemingly everything in between, while always getting it to fit within his established style and remain recognizable as a Ski Mask production. But what really cemented this album's spot over Waiting for the World is the fact that I've listened to this album almost just as frequently as that one, and it's over double the length. This is a 90-minute album with 18 tracks. It's a massive and sprawling commitment, and yet I've never remotely felt that length. I put it on and let it play out in its full entirety regularly, and those 90 minutes zip by so quickly I feel like I could just put it on again immediately after it's done. Every single banger goes ridiculously hard and gets me really excited. Every atmospheric cut totally sinks me into its vibe. And even with 18 tracks, I don't feel like a single one of these is redundant or skippable, or even one that falls below really freaking good. I suppose I would get it if you thought it was too long, or maybe too unfocused, and wanted him to stick to more of the ambient breakbeat material he explored on Compro. But first of all, it's not like he doesn't still deliver more of that here. And second of all, the length and variety is obviously part of the primary appeal for me. It wouldn't be the same if it were shorter and sameier. If Ski Mask can pull off an album like this so well, he could even be in it for the long haul and keep pulling out gems for the foreseeable future without having to try that hard. And even if he doesn't, Pool is the kind of album that could have only been made by someone who is just as much of a nerd for the wide world of electronic music and its history as I am. And its existence just made me feel so validated as someone who's dedicated so much of his life to this genre and highlighting how much variety there is to experience within it. And for that and everything else I've mentioned, I had to mark it as my favorite album of 2021. Here's to more great electronic music next year and in all the years to come. And yeah, that's my list. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next year.